Today I'm joined by Bianca Prins, freelance influencer, blogger, researcher and speaker, a global head of accessibility at the ING. Welcome, Bianca.
Thank you for having me, Tim.
Very happy that you are willing to take the time to record a podcast with us. Let's get right into it. I would like to know before we enter all of the other topics, to know a little bit more about your journey into accessibility and how you became the head of accessibility at the ING. I know there must be a lot of backstory behind it, so I'm keen to know.
I'm happy to share. Actually, and I think the start lies with the fact that I have a visual disability myself, which is also the reason why I have yellow glasses or dark glasses when I walk outside. So from that perspective, I think that's one of the crucial elements in finally ending up in this role. But in essence, actually, I started working in healthcare. And one of the things happened there was that we faced an organizational change because of government policy changing. And when things happened, I was like, why is the organization responding like this? Which brought me to the decision to start studying and to actually to restart studying. I started business administration. Working on that, I ran into sustainability and especially on the social part. And I wrote my first paper on sustainable employment. And that was back in 2010. And based on that paper, I ended up at one of the round tables in Parliament, rediscussing how the Netherlands would review their employability policies for people with disabilities, ending up at ING because they were working on a program for persons with disabilities and wanted my opinion on what the program looked like. And it was quite interesting because I gave them quite a few pointers, which also came out of my research from my study. And they were saying, oh, this is good. And they started working on that. Asked me if I was interested in a job. And I said no, because I've got my business, working freelance at the time and trying to get organizations to hire more people with disabilities. And at the point, in my paper, I already addressed accessibility, but more from a perspective of making sure you facilitate persons with a disability so they can do their work well. In essence, the word accessibility, for me, it was quite something new. But it was also the period that the UN CRPD discussion started in the Netherlands. So accessibility grew as a topic. And I grew with it in the whole period until 2015, when the UN CRPD was ratified by the Dutch Parliament. So from that perspective, I think in the base, with my work in relation to employability of persons with disability, the whole journey started there. But it was also the realization that accessibility is needed. And even when I didn't realize the word accessibility at the time, how much impact it had, started all there. So when I joined ING in 2015 in the environmental and social risk team, a few months in, I got the question, would you like to write a proposal for an accessibility program? And I said yes, because at the time I was planning to stay about 6 months at ING because it was a temporary assignment based on my human rights background. And I didn't want to work for a bank, which is also really funny. So from that perspective, I started writing the plan. Took me a bit longer than a half year. In the end, it was, I think, the whole journey to getting the plan approved was almost a year. So in February 2017, I went to the CIO from ING Netherlands at the time. He was also related to the management board for the group. And that was Ron van Kemenade. And he said to me, he just asked me, I said, can you do this? And I said, yes. And his only answer was, then you're going to do this. So from that perspective, all of a sudden, as of having an idea to make ING an accessible bank, at first was a program which I started on my own, and started actually with a few things. And those things were the things I learned when I traveled to Washington, D.C. for the Enabling Conference. And that was my first one in 2017. And the interesting part was that even when I thought, because of all the research I did and the work I did in Europe, I know my things about accessibility. But I think I was in that conference for about 2 hours and I thought, I don't know shit. Pardon my words for that, but it was really the truth because it really opened my eyes on all the possibilities there were. And I never realized the extensiveness of it. On the other side, and that was intriguing because of the work I did and the research I did, I also got a lot of positive feedback on the ideas and the thoughts I had already when I started. So from that perspective, I found a form of respect, even when I was new into the group of international experts. But I also found a place where I could gather a lot of knowledge and took that along. And actually, based on, I think, most of the things I learned at the conference and also the conversations afterwards, I wrote a policy proposal for accessibility for ING. And now, after all these years, we're finalizing. It's not going to be a policy. It's going to be called a Consolidated Accessibility Mandatory Instruction, which is not a very accessible word. So I hope we can write policy on it for publications perspective, because otherwise we have to explain this incredible wordings. But it was a long journey. It was a long journey because even when people saw the need, there still was a discussion of what is our role. And also one of the crucial things, and I believe this is the crucial part of accessibility, keep your people with a disability within the organization into the discussion. So when I was allowed to start a steer group for accessibility within the steer committee for the accessibility for the global group, I said we have to have Enable in this committee because we cannot do this without us. And if we want to adhere to the UN SRPD, we have to do this with the community of persons with disability working at ING. And till the day of today, they're still there. And I intend to keep them there. And sometimes I even say if it's the last thing I would do, because I believe it's crucial to have their voice heard. When we wrote the policy, so when I wrote the policy, I also included the employee voice in there. They were in the group of people who were giving feedback, who were giving input, as well as, for example, reputational risk, HR. So from that perspective, everybody's voice was heard. And I think that's not being seen often enough. So it's a short, my journey. Very short.
No, but I think great. So this eye-opening moment for you at the conference in DC was a great value to you. Is this conference still being hosted every year?
Oh yes, it is. Enabling is actually this year, I think 5 to 7 October. Not completely sure, but I think it's 5 to 7 October in Washington. They moved to a bigger venue because the other venue was every year filled out. So they hope to attract more people coming in. I think it will be an interesting one because all the developments in the US, we already see that accessibility is absolutely not excluded from what's currently happening within the DEI space. So it will be a little bit interesting what the American organizations will going to do, because the executive order actually says that they also will look into businesses after 3 months. So from that perspective, it's not just the government which is impacted. What's going to happen, nobody knows. But on the other side, the momentum is there. because the European Accessibility Act is entered just before. We see also things happening in Australia, in Asia, developments going quite fast. So from that perspective, it's an interesting place to be. And to be honest, you should be there. If you are serious about accessibility, it's a long way to travel, but it's worth every penny.
All right. I will definitely keep that one on top of my list, and for sure. Um, thanks for sharing this intro. And so you've been inspired there to go ahead and finish this plan that you had, that you was writing for the ING, and that made you step into the role of global head of accessibility as well, right?
Yeah, the plan I wrote resulted in the role, and at first it was called project manager at global project manager accessibility, which in 2 months became global head of accessibility because there was confusion about a lot of stuff. And if you look at it, because you can have two types of global heads, I'm more the content global head of. So from that perspective, also given the fact that I work 20 hours due to my visual disability, my role is really on the content. I'm also, some call it the advocate or evangelist or whatever role you will name it, especially in the first years, because I think if I look back now, in the period 2017 to 2021, we were really focusing on building awareness. Well, even while I already had the policy, I had a strategic plan, which was not officially strategy, but I had a strategic plan. It was really focused on getting people engaged. And this is the first part you have to do. But while I was working on the engagement, I was also walking around, and there the banking part comes in, and you obviously know as working at ABN, is that we had the same problem as I heard from everybody else working within the financial sector. Our risk domains are so closed off, and accessibility overarches everything, resulting in the problem that everybody said, hey, this is an important policy, but it's not mine because it's also about digital, physical, or employee. So from that perspective,
Yeah, and then it becomes nobody's issue. Because it's
exactly.
everyone's
And
issue. Yeah.
it's everyone's issue, but it also becomes nobody's issue, resulting in me being sort of a risk officer in the first line, knowing what was wrong, and not being able to act on it as I would like to. And that gave me quite some struggles at times, because I saw things happening which I knew that would impact even on the date of the 28th of June 2025, and it was 2020 or something, knowing that if you wouldn't act now, you would be too late. So from that perspective, it feels quite annoying if you were so proactive, while the banking sector is quite a reactive sector to work in. So it's a whole different way of thinking. And I think sometimes that is also my biggest barrier working at a bank for me as a person.
I see. Yeah, I see. And this plan that you wrote, it was a really broad plan. So it was it was nobody's issue. So you tried managing that, and in this broader the broader plan about accessibility, there was also mentions of the digital accessibility as well.
Yeah, what we had and what we still have and what we're still working on actually is that already in the first business case, we said accessibility is about everything. So it's about a bank card, which we have with the accessible card with a notch in the Netherlands, Belgium, and Australia, for example, which was my first project I started in 2017, which is always fun to call it out. But that's practical things, but also about digital accessibility. And right from the start, I already included that in the business case, that if you would have to do remediations, the cost would be really high. And if you would train staff on applying accessibility right from the start, that it saves a lot of money because it becomes a way of working. And in the end, it's even negligible what extra costs you have because they disappear in the end. And I think from that perspective, that realization was there really fast. It was there with me. It was also there with the people who supported me from senior level. On the other side, of not realizing at that time that middle management was the crucial part to go to, because in the end, reevaluating, especially last year and the year before, was that if I look back, we shouldn't have focused so much on the high, also on the C-suite management, but we also had to focus on the middle management because the middle management can block a lot. And it's not because they don't want to, but it's because they have so many things on their plate, they don't need anything extra.
Yep. It's very recognizable.
Exactly. And that's the interesting thing. And the fun part was, I didn't realize it back then in 2018, 2019, when we had the discussions, because everybody was saying, yeah, you have to go to the top. And if you have the CEO or the COO with you, then everything will be going okay. And I was like, I have the CIO with me. Why is this not working? So it was really a struggle to figure out, but in the end, it was middle management. And as soon as the focus also came there, we saw that they realized it's not too big of an extra work. And I think, sorry, I put that off, but
yeah, audible again.
So, but I think that's the crucial step that a lot of people forget, that you need your middle management, because if they are overwhelmed, they won't include accessibility because it's an extra work. And as long as it's not integrated in your way of working, it is. And as long as they don't realize the importance of it and the customer value which is there, then it's really hard to bring it in.
Yeah. It only becomes extra work when you don't take it into account as from the start.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's completely right. So it has to be built into the processes of developing something. It has to be built into the quality checks. It has to be built in part of automation as well. There's so many things you can do.
It starts already with writing the code. I mean, if your code is already wrong, if it's the basic code already missing crucial elements, it's the first block which already goes wrong. And in essence, I mean, I sometimes compare it to the blockchain technology. If your first block is wrong, your whole stash is going to be unstable. And that's, I think, the crucial part where accessibility, where it shows that accessibility should be built on from the start, because your foundation, or in this case, in this example, the central block, the starting block, is not okay, then you will continue to run in that problem, and you are going to continue to fix it. And it's always more expensive to fix it in a later stage than to make sure that you build it in the right way.
Yeah, no, definitely. And since we're now talking, we both work for large Dutch banks. I like to compare or make a comparison between accessibility and security, because security is seen as this super important topic. Of course, for many big organizations, it is rightly so. And accessibility is also, with due to part of the EU Accessibility Act coming up, it's getting some traction as well. But it's not at the same level still as the security, for example. But for me, it's really hard as an engineer, for example, working for a bank. It's quite hard actually to push something to production that is insecure. That then all kinds of monitors will go off, then my pipeline will break, then all of these other things will happen. Lights will turn red. But if I push something to production which is inaccessible, nothing happens yet. So
no,
that's
the
also
interesting part. That's the interesting part. And one of the fun things is, based on that first M enabling conference that I attended, I also got into that part. And I was working as global head of accessibility from within the global process management team at the time. And I had a discussion with one of my colleagues within process management, as he said, you know what, we should write a customer journey assessment which fits this one. And actually, we've written that customer journey assessment. And it was really fun because I wrote it with Judith together, and she laughed, and I continued with another colleague of mine. But the fun part is actually that fundamental customer journey assessment is still on our webpage, on our internal webpage, to say, okay, if you want to design accessible, use this assessment. And there are a few crucial things in there. First one is, if you are going to start on a product, inform with customers or users, because it's also about employees, of course, but inform what people with a disability need. The second one is, we have a set of personas where we explain, but we don't take the easy ones. So, for example, one of the personas we are actually using is a persona who is blind and deaf. And the interesting part is that's one of the toughest groups to support. And if you can support them, the chance is so small that your product is not accessible in a testing phase, which is the third part of this, that you say, okay. And what we also give is, we give guidelines. So one of the crucial guidelines, and that's an interesting approach, which differs in my personal approach compared to many of the digital experts, I say start first with universal design. And if you use the universal design principles and then also compare these to the WCAG criteria, that brings a whole different area. Because in some cases, and that's also in my case, is that a WCAG criteria can be met, but it's not accessible for me because I have a complex visual disability, meaning that a standard solution often doesn't work. And that's the interesting part, because I noticed that when you use universal design principles, these non-standard solutions actually do show up instead of working just from the criteria. And that's one of the worries I do have at the moment, is that we see new experts stepping up, and these experts have a lot of knowledge on the exact application of, this is WCAG, you have to do this, and this, and they know all the check boxes. But when you ask them, what do you do when it becomes complex? They have no idea. Or if you ask them about universal design, then they don't know what it is. So, and that is worrying, because we really need the real experts. And I'm not the first one who says it, but you really need the real experts. And those are the people who are working within this space for years now. It can be silent, like you. I mean, there's a lot of people who are working in the shadows in bigger organizations, trying to push the accessibility agenda, didn't get heard, and then being overthrown by an external auditor that says, yeah, but you have to do this, and then you comply to WCAG, and if you get an automated test, you're okay. But what about manual testing?
Yeah.
And if you ask them, they don't know the answer.
No. They know how to audit, and that sells really well, I would say. But
that is something we have to be careful of, because it's a very simple question I often ask. Are you in this for compliance, or are you in this space for accessibility? Because if you're in the space for accessibility, you don't just know the regulations, because knowing these, it's quite easy. But if you're in there for accessibility, you should know about what are the disability models? How do these impact how people view accessibility and disability? How important is it to work on a design which is not just accessible, but also offers equality? So I can give you a very fun example from a study book. I did a course on designing, and it was quite funny because the example was so great. And I could look up the author, but I don't know it from out of my tip of my head. But the thing was, it was about a design they did for a copy machine, and they had to develop a tool which made the machine accessible for people who are blind. So they thought, in their Dutch way, because it was a Dutch organization, you know what? we make a tool which you can connect to the copy machine and then it's okay. But it was for a US business. And they sent the ID and it worked and they tested it with people with a disability from the Netherlands and everybody was happy. And they got back, no, this is not good. And why it wasn't good? Because it was not equality. It was a workaround for persons with disabilities instead of making the menu accessible for persons who are blind. And that's the big difference between following the regulations and saying, okay, I know this and this has to be done, or making sure that something is equitable. And if it's equitable, then it's really accessible for a person with a disability. And then it's not just about regulation, because it can even be not in compliance, because compliance can also sometimes bring up a barrier because it doesn't work for everybody. Yeah. And if you can explain this to your monitoring authority, and that's where the expert comes in, and you can explain to your monitoring authority and say, okay, we found out, we did the check. No, in a digital example, it's not completely compliant with WCAG 2.1 AA, but if we do it like that, it's not accessible for all users. If we do it like this, and we tested it with a group of users, a description of the group of users, then you can show it is accessible. And I'm really interested in what a monitoring authority in that case would say, because are we working on accessibility or are we working on compliance with the legislation? Because sometimes we know that the legislation is not always as inclusive as it should be.
No, definitely. I think in terms of what are we doing, in terms of like big organizations, mainly want to be, that's sad to say, but they want to be compliant, and they have less care for being accessible. That's something I still see. I think that's about right.
Have you heard Deborah Rue is always yelling that out on LinkedIn? Compliance is the floor.
Yeah.
And but we have to aim for the ceiling. And I think that's a real great statement, because if you only look at the basics, but you don't look up.
Yeah.
And that's the interesting part, because accessibility doesn't stop. If the EAA enters on the 28th of June, we're not done. We're only a part of it.
I think I see it more as a chance for a lot of organizations to get some awakening about accessibility, come to maybe know about it for the first time, and also a way for them to start the journey. But yeah, definitely not
if
done.
You start on June 28th, you're
yeah, no. But also leading up to it, of course. But also some of our organizations, I think they will start from that date. I also learned that's also how the law was, the intention behind it was also to get better over time.
No, but that's the interesting part. So that's why I said, if you, in the end, working with finance, the rec statuses, the green, the orange, the amber orange, and the red one. And I think if you have an amber status or orange status, which says, okay, I have a path to green, meaning compliance, and you have an action plan for that, that especially until 2030, the monitoring authorities are okay with that, as long as you can prove that you're working on it. And I think there lies the crucial element in here. If you're red and you don't take action, then you should get a fine, and you should be pushed to take action. If you are in amber and you have an action plan, you have a path to green, that means that you're working on it. But you can also have an opportunity when you work in green. You can also have the opportunity to end up in red, because if you're in green and you are compliant, but you don't keep up and you don't have the action plan to make sure that you stay in the green zone, you can end up in the red zone anyway. And that's, I think, the last one is what's often forgotten. And I notice that quite often because that's the part of having so many programs popping up now, which have an end date. And the end date is so often July 1st, 2025. But in essence, it's starting at that date.
Yeah.
It's not
Definitely.
it's not the end, it's the start.
Yeah. And it should be the start of something very nice, start of a journey that can give you so much as an organization, including basically all your users fully, especially for example, working in financial industry. Making payments is one of the essential aspects, I think, nowadays of everyone's life.
It's not just making payments. I think it's more than just making payments. It's
Mhm.
if you look at the role, and that's maybe the crucial reason why I like to work at the bank, even when I never wanted to work at a bank, is
Mhm.
when I started ESR, I realized the importance of having equal access to financial products and services. For everybody, it means that you have the opportunity for economic participation. Without access to banking services, you don't have equality in economic participation. So, from that perspective, it's not just doing a payment, it's also having access to a mortgage to buy your house, especially for persons with disabilities, meaning that if you can buy a house because you have a job, it helps to be independent in living and not being able to, for example, if you need a lift because you cannot walk the stairs anymore and you own the house, it's much easier to get that lift into your house than it is when you
Mhm.
have a rental house. So making those are the crucial things which increase economic independence. And what people often don't realize is that people with a disability, they do have a bank account because in most countries you need a bank account, otherwise you cannot get your welfare check, or if you have work, you cannot get your wages. So from that perspective, the bank account they often have. They're not always able to use it them independently, but they have the bank account. But it's not just about having that account, it's actually to do something with that account. And that's the part. Having financial independence means you can make your decisions, even if it requires help, because in some cases, people with, for example, low IQ, but they are legally bound to make their own financial decisions. We should make sure that groups don't become victims of people who abuse them financially, and actually they're at risk of become involved in third party
Mhm.
fraud because they don't understand. So that's something we must make sure that people understand what is because it's also responsibility. It's a responsibility that you understand what it means to have a bank account, that you cannot share your personal codes with anybody else. And one of the things, if things are not digital accessible, people are sharing their codes because they need to ask somebody else to help them to manage their finances. That's not independent living. So, from that perspective, it's really important to make sure that part is accessible, but it's also about the mortgage. Do you have equal opportunity to get a mortgage?
Yeah.
In some countries, you see problems with insurance. So if you have a disability, it's really hard to get the right insurance, which you need to buy a house. That's in essence, it's not fair because you are excluded from the service from something which is outside your, which is outside something you can influence. So from that perspective, it's a whole complex system. It's not just about making sure that the bank account is digital accessible and making sure that people can manage their finances themselves. But it's also about the equality in access to financial products. And that can only happen when you can make your own decisions and you can have access to financial services, and making sure that digital accessibility in this part, because we mostly bank digital in especially in the Netherlands, then you
Mhm.
see that without that, you cannot offer equality in access to financial services. So it's a balance. It's not
Yeah.
one or the other. It has to do both. And that's why it's coming back to the conversation we had earlier before we started this. is that that's the part where you see it's so important to have an overarching policy for accessibility. Because if something happens in A, it impacts B. And you cannot say, okay, I have everything written down in B2 level. My terms and conditions are good. But if the terms and conditions are unreadable with a screen reader, it doesn't matter that you wrote them easily. The person who is blind, needing the screen reader, cannot read the terms and conditions. But who's responsible then? It's not the communications team or it's not the customer journey team who wrote them because they did their part. It's actually so from that perspective, it's that balance in whose responsibility, and that's for me one of the biggest worries. If you look at the Netherlands, that because the Dutch version of the European Accessibility Act, it's been brought in with different ministries, meaning that there are multiple people who have to look at who's responsible for what. But they don't always know who is responsible for which area because the overlap is there. There's a lot of gray area. So what's going to happen? We don't know. And that's quite worrying because it also brings insecurity for the business who really want to do good.
Yeah. And can we even comply to the initial European acts if it's hosted like this?
To be honest, I think it's easier to comply to the original European Accessibility Act than to the Dutch version of the Accessibility Act because it's been brought under in different legislations, meaning you have to deal with different legislations. And for example, for us in the banking sector, you see there's a high focus on digital, but there's less focus on e-commerce, which is also in the EAA. There's less focus on communications, and communications is also there. So technically, and that's for any sector. If you would be in communications like the T-Mobile, then you would look at the communications part. If you're at the bank, you're looking at the finance legislation, which is applicable on you. So from that perspective, from the sector part, it's a logical consequence of a decision made. On the other side, because everything connects together in the end, it is much easier to look into the European Accessibility Act as a whole instead of looking at all these different legislations because it becomes more complex.
No, definitely. But that's something we do good over here, making it more complex.
Yeah, that's. I think we're famous for that.
Yeah, indeed. But thank you for this broad perspective on my comment as well, because this really it's really struck me. Indeed, it's really good to know also this perspective, and I think really important to share this as well. Thank you for that. And in terms of like making it everyone's problem, we indeed spoke about that. I think a big part of it is getting in the proper training for all of these different roles. What's the strategy you take here?
The current strategy within ING is that we are working on training, which is based on it is role based. So you have role based training opportunities. If you're, for example, within the front end or you're content owner, you have specific trainings which reside with your role. General accessibility fundamentals should be there for everyone. The only difference in how I would do it is that it's not an obligated training. So it's still based on the teams training of often a few. Some of the teams train everybody. So it really differs per team. But if it would be my personal my personal program, would say it like that. And if I would give a recommendation to organizations, I would say train everybody on accessibility. And that means literally everybody, because digital accessibility, actually, we are all involved with that. Everybody who publishes an email, everybody who publishes a PDF document is involved with accessibility and with digital accessibility, meaning that the very basic training of accessibility fundamentals and document accessibility, those should be trainings that anyone in any organization who works with email should do. And that's something I've been advocating for also within the international community for a longer time, because I know, and I've been in many committees, I've been in working groups, and there's a lot of discussions always about champion models, and you have champion, and the champion can work with everybody. But there's also a boundary to what the champion can do, because the champion does that often next to his or her role. The champion ends up doing all the stuff that everybody within that team should be able to do themselves. So in the end, the champion is fixing instead of building. And I think that's the crucial difference with the approach I advocate for, and will continue to advocate for also within ING, is to say it's a mandatory training. Everybody should have digital accessibility training, knowing very simple things you have to do from your role. And it doesn't even make a difference if you are a customer journey expert who sends letter to a customer, or you're a backend developer, because in the end we all work together on that product, which is, and I think from that perspective, it's really important to do it like that. And if you look at the role-based trainings, there are many options. But what we also see is that people who are really interested continue, so they don't stop with what's obligated, they continue to learn. I mean, that's also how you ended up probably in becoming a digital accessibility expert, because you continued, you liked it. And I think that's the big difference, because if we have if we work with the champions, those are people who like the topic and share. But what we also find, what I also find out, is that the more people get involved, they like it. So it's not just, for example, 100 champions in a 20,000 people organization. Then it becomes 20,000 people within the organization, and you also have 1,000 champions because they really like the topic, and they continue to pull everybody in and to keep them. And the third part of that is not even bigger, I think, is that it's not just a training which you do once. You have to maintain knowledge. So one of the things that I also suggested is that you have a evaluation training, like every year or every 2 year, where you can check, do I still know? Okay, I don't know this topic, so I need to revisit those trainings. But also updates. I mean, there are innovations coming up. We see new accessibility solutions for that coming up. So you need to have continuous training. And that's also one of the crucial things which I notice now with the EAA. You see people get trained, but they could get trained on the stage we currently are. But if you look at, for example, the impact of AI coming in, it's going really fast, and you need to know what you're working on. And that doesn't stop with one training. It's something you need to work and continue on for years. It's like all you work at a bank, all the KYC trainings you get, all the security trainings you get, they have to be repeated. And but on the other side, I also realize quite often if I do these trainings, when I start them, I think, okay, again. But it's so many times, like, I forgot that one. And that's the part. It's about having that light shed on the topic you run out of because you didn't interact with it enough, but because maybe you're gonna run into it the next week, and then you know what to do. And I think those are crucial. So it's three elements. It's role-based training, it has to be mandatory, and it also has to be maintained. Within ING, we're not there yet. It will be something I will continue to advocate for. I also know it's not easy to get there. Because we already have a lot of trainings. And I think that's with every business, we see the same thing. There's a lot of trainings going on. Do we need an extra mandatory training? There are costs involved. I mean, every mandatory training you do, and especially accessibility, is long. It takes a long time to train. So it's also a financial loss in that part of people not bringing in money, but they cost money for the time they're doing a training. In the end, if you see the benefit of trainings and compare that to remediation costs and hiring all the external experts is much more expensive than investing in the training. And I think from that perspective, in general, banking, if I would be the one who had the opportunity to say, do it differently, is be more proactive. And in this case, it's about accessibility, but do proactive training. Because if you're ready for what's coming, it's much easier to respond. And a very simple example, which we all see happening now, is that the whole storm coming in on diversity policies and disability and accessibility in the US, it also makes us realize that I at that moment, I was ready for that. And it sounds really weird, but already when I started accessibility, I said I don't want to be within the DEI space. I don't want to be within the HR space. It shouldn't reside there because accessibility is operational. Disability inclusion isn't not. So we separated it out. We have the track disability inclusion, which resides with our DEI, and we have accessibility, which is fairly operational.
I think that's a very wise decision there. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the interesting part because now I see people from the US coming to me and say, "Hey, you did that." And that's actually somebody who messaged me directly, and she said, "I told you you were so bad for disability inclusion because you separated it out, but now I get why you did it." And that's the thing because DEI policies, they really depend on who's in charge, not just in the government as we see with Trump, but we also see that within organizations. And from that perspective, accessibility, it is an operational topic. And you're working within IT. And yes, I see a lot of successes within IT, but on the other side, how much reach do you have to the other domains within the organization? And if you're working from operations, your reach is much bigger. It's like process management. Process management comes in any place within the organization. It can be risk, it can be the customer side, it can be IT. And that's the same thing for accessibility. If you really want to be successful, you need to make sure that you have the reach throughout the whole organization. And then you can set up the best IT accessibility team within IT. You still need that. But in general, if you really want to make it happen and you really want to get to the part where you can grow your accessibility policies, your strategy, you need much more than just being in IT, just being in HR. You need to have that reach. It's the same thing with having one accessibility policy instead of a IT policy for accessibility. In essence, it's the same because everything is interconnected. You can make a decision on accessibility, but it also impacts the people who are working with the system.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for these great insights. I think very valuable and also I think we still have a long way to go. But yeah, this also gives me a lot of inspiration on ways to go forward.
I got a
it's
question for you.
very valuable. Yes,
Based on
of course.
based on the conversation, what would be the first thing you need for your next step?
For my next step, someone like you with the Navian. No, definitely, yeah. Yeah,
I don't know
yeah.
if the world would appreciate a 2.0 version of me, but okay.
No, I think
You
that's
mean
the
the role?
the role. Yeah, yeah. No, but someone like you in the role would also be fine. Fine, I would say, because I think you bring a lot of power and sharpness and readiness to the table, I would say. And I think that's what we need. A bold advocate from time to time is not bad. Definitely not someone advocating for this minority group, whose voice isn't heard that much, unfortunately.
Yeah,
So
that
I think
is
you are
a
really
good
doing a
point.
great job there. Yeah, and
Thank you.
indeed, I'm more into the IT part. That's also where my background lies. The things I can do currently are limited, but the things I can do, I try to do them as good as possible, of course. And
Would
for
you
taking
like
the
such a
naps,
role?
I do.
If you would
Yeah.
get the opportunity.
Mm. Um, yeah, I would definitely like it, but speaking to you also, I realize I'm not there yet.
But
But
that's doable. You can learn.
mhm. Yeah, of
You
course,
got to
no,
where you
definitely.
are.
Yeah, of course, of course. Yeah, I would like it definitely, and I think I could also, I also could do it. I know for sure. I just by saying I'm not on that level yet, I want to be honest and say, okay, still need to learn more about the topic. Still, there are some topics I need to get into in more detail. I know a lot about the digital parts. I'm leading a lot of different projects, which I think are really valuable, or giving engineering teams a lot of good insights in ways they can improve their digital products, becoming more accessible. But that's just a piece of the cake, and the topic is way broader. But for currently, I really like the role that I'm doing right now.
Yeah, but you demonstrate something important, especially in your response. And that's why I asked you. Because we need more people, we need more people in equal roles like I have. But it's you do show what is needed in such role. Because we do see many people who end up in this role started in IT or in HR or in
Mm,
any area, but they were eager to learn and they were eager to develop. And if you have that eagerness, then you are material to become a head of accessibility within ABN or somewhere else. And I think that's one of the things which is often underestimated. Um, I always say, and that's one of the things I really say to anybody who sets up a team, you need to have people with a disability who are also accessibility experts. Um, you also need a few people without because they can help you to keep both feet on the ground because you are advocating too much for
mm,
accessibility. And that's not saying that you cannot have too much, but it's more based on the fact that sometimes you want things which the organization isn't ready for. And the people without a disability who are having experience within the organization can help you keep your feet on the ground and say, okay, you know what? It's not going to be like this, but if we do A, B, C, D, we can still get to A, original A. So from that perspective, you need a balance.
yeah.
But eagerness to learn, and especially eagerness to learn from persons with disabilities themselves, those are the crucial things you need. And
Yeah.
second thing, continuing on this path, I saw it happening this week with an accessibility expert who was saying maybe we should scrap the word disability because it's all about persons. And that's
Mm,
also something which is sort of an unwritten rule. But as an accessibility expert, you are not going to say that you should not talk about disability because it's all about equality and then you don't need to label it because actually
mm,
there's also pride. And that's the same thing for me. I worked 20 hours. I got my role within ING. And there were a lot of people who were told me that it was not possible because I worked 20 hours. And still some things happen around me because people want to take a load off my shoulders and they think, you know what, I decide that for you. To be honest, that's annoying. Um, Even if it's well meant, it remains something that is annoying. But the crucial part on this is actually that persons with disabilities really know what they need.
mhm,
And if you leave the disability out of that conversation, then you cannot talk about accessibility. So any person is a person at first. And that's why I personally prefer person first language, making sure that you always say person with a disability and not disabled person. In some cases, you can use the word disabled, of course, but it's also depending on what people want, who you have the conversation with. But it's in the end, it is about the people. But because of accessibility, you can put the person first. And that's why it's not up to us to have a discussion about saying, okay, you know what, as accessibility expert, it's not okay to have the discussion. You should not have that. That's a discussion people with disabilities should have amongst themselves. And there the fun part comes in if you belong to both, because that gives a little bit more leverage on those discussions. On the other side, I do try to separate it out and say, okay, you know what? This is not my discussion. This is a discussion for the disability advocates. And it can break you if you can make the wrong comment. I've seen it with a friend of mine who accidentally, without realizing, used the word all abilities at a conference. Even with 15 years experience, having spoken for many disability organizations, many people got so mad for using the word all abilities. And those are the things you really have to be aware of as an accessibility expert. Know what you're saying, know what you can say, and what you cannot say. So that would be my my thing to give everybody who's listening today.
Thank you so much. And I'm also going to thank you for the conversation we had. I think this was very insightful. Hopefully also for the users, but I definitely liked it myself as well. So thank you, Bianca. Before we round up, where can people find you online if they would like to follow you?
You can find me on Blue Sky, and it's very easy. It's Bianca.Prins, so it's very easy to find. Bianca Prins, Blue Sky. And you can find me on LinkedIn. And also, if you're interested in my research, you can look at www.cvworks.nl, and there's an English page with my international work, and there's a Dutch page with also Dutch publications. And these are mostly also because I have my 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 AAP credentials as a certified expert on accessibility. So from that perspective, I also have my publications.
All right, great, thank you. And for all the listeners, if you would like this podcast, please consider subscribing, liking, rating, leaving a comment with feedback. Always welcome. If you would like to improve where we can, of course, if you have something nice to say, please also leave that. That gives us some nice way forward. Thank you so much. And thank you again, Bianca, for taking the time. Hopefully, I have to have you on another time. I'm sure we have a lot of more topics to discuss in the accessibility space. So thank you a lot.
Always happy to join.
All right, great. Thanks. And yep, see you.
Bye.